Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome back to another episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate you listening. I'm your co-host, Greg Bryan. I'm joined with my other co-host, or the other co-host of this show, Jim Reske. And tonight we're going to do a little debrief because Jim just recently taught on Galatians chapters 3 through 6. The second part of the book of Galatians, and he did an amazing, 4. Yeah, that's right. 4, 5, and 6.
Yeah, you did 1, 2, and 3.
I did 1, 2, and 3. Jim did 4, 5, and 6. You did a fantastic job, Jim.
Well, thanks, Greg. I thought yours was great too. That was like a 1-2 punch. It was so nice.
I don't know if you saw my standing ovation at the end, but I was.
I thought, was that tomato from you? I thought that was from you.
The tomato, yeah. Just ignore that. Ignore that. But what we like to do is there's a talk that we prepare, and we often do podcasts just as we're preparing for these Bible studies that we teach. And then we usually broadcast the Bible study itself, which we've done recently. And then we like to do kind of the AfterTalk. Sometimes I call it the talk that we wish we would have given, because sometimes there's the talk you prepare, the talk you deliver, and then the talk you wish you would have delivered. So, Jim, what are some of your observations about, as you reflect on your talk? Is there anything you wish you would have said that you didn't?
Well, there's a whole bunch of things I wish I would have done differently. And I'm thinking that when we did the debrief for your talk, and you were saying, actually, it came off okay. It was kind of like, remember it's one of your better, simpler debriefs, because you were saying I kind of said the things I wanted to say and said them in the way I wanted to say them, and I think it was okay. There's a bunch of little things I would change. I think
let's discuss them.
Yeah, so just this is no particular order, though I'll try to divide them into like style and substance. So like style points are just the way I was speaking and the way I was trying to communicate these things, and then some substance, some theology things that have come up, that came up during the talk and since. Some that I couldn't get in, some that I dropped in the interest of time. And so we'll get to that. But just in terms of style, I did go back. I had to listen to it again because we were editing it for time. And so I listened to it, and it's, first of all, I get a lot of feedback or criticism in general that I'm talking too fast. And I hear that, and I'm trying to slow down. I get really excited about these points. I feel like there's a lot to cover. I want to make sure I get it in the time allotted. And as you and I often talk about, this is an open forum Bible studies. For the listeners' benefit, we usually have 50 or 60 people there in person, anywhere from 20. Last week we had 39 on Zoom, Greg.
Yep.
So, live streaming, watching it. And anyone can interrupt you anytime with questions. So planning the time is a challenge. And if it's just something it's a challenge for everybody, it's what you do. If you were some preacher in church, you say, I've got 20 minutes for my sermon or 40 minutes of the sermon, you can time it out. You could just practice it. You could read it and your timing is perfect. But if, 2 minutes if you're a preacher and 2 minutes into your sermon, someone raises their hand and says, I'm not sure I agree with that. I want to talk about this. And, it's just, the timing is always a bit of a thing. So I feel that pressure of timing, and that I think I end up talking fast because I have these thoughts. I want to get them out. Because I know that, inevitably there'll be discussion and challenge questions and all the rest to kind of take that. But this time that's a common thing I'm trying to work on.
Yeah. Let me address that real quick, because
go ahead.
You do speak fast, but I take it as it's excitement. It comes across to me like how excited you are to communicate God's word and God's truth and the things that you've discovered. So, and I don't have a problem with it at all.
Oh, good. Well, that's good.
I don't think it doesn't I don't know that it's something you need to work on, like to change.
Well, I'll tell you in particular, because listening to it again, and by the way, I almost never do this. I don't know if you do, but I generally hate to go back and listen to yourself because it just cringe almost.
I don't like listening to myself either.
No, no. So rather not do that. But this time I did, and I thought because I'm trying, I have this feeling. I am excited about it. I am, and I do want to get the thoughts out. I end up doing two things in particular. One is clipping off my own sentences. So I'm so eager to get to the next sentence. I'll be in the middle of one sentence. Anyway, I start the next sentence that way. I just want to, but it just gets, and so I'm clipping off my own sentences and not finishing them and just go right to the next one. And I just like, wow, I didn't know that I did that until I listened to it. And then I realized, oh, I'm like interrupting myself and not finishing the thought and it's jumping to the next one. So that was one thing. And then another thing is that I find that in this talk in particular, I don't know if I always do this, but because I don't go back and listen, but in this one, I would sometimes switch my point of view in the talk. So I'm saying something to you about Galatians, and then I'd say, but this is what the Judaizers would say, and they would say this. And I would be talking in the Judaizers' voice, and then I was talking about the people who teach rewards theology. And the way I should introduce it is the way I'm doing it with you now. I say, now, wait a second. The Judaizers had that to say, but if the rewards people could speak, they would say this in response. And then the listener knows the next thing you're saying is from that perspective of this party. And then you drop that and you say, but I would say a way to reconcile these, whatever. So the person always knows what perspective you're taking. And what I found listening to it is I would jump around quickly and just jump into that voice and say something and then answer that criticism or respond from the opposite view. And like, I'm not taking the listener along with me. And I think people kind of generally get the gist of what perspective you're saying when you say these things, but I just noticed that, and it's a speaking habit that I was totally unaware of.
Well, and some of that,
and say, well,
and some of that, you might pick it up. You might pick it up easier because you're listening to audio only, but you actually had visuals too. You had a slideshow. So you were at times referring to a chart.
Right.
And so I think that the audience that was present there was able to follow you. But those are interesting observations. And I mean, in that sense, I think, that could be a skill to kind of sharpen up, is like not clipping your own sentences. That's pretty interesting.
I'm sure I've done it my whole life, Craig. I just never really noticed it before. Like I'm probably doing it in this conversation now. And if I would go back to listen, you say, oh yeah, you're not even letting yourself speak. You're so excited to get to the next sentence that you drop the last 10% of the last sentence and just go on. And then that shifting perspective thing, I thought, as a speaker, I'm listening to myself. I know what perspective I'm taking, but I gotta be more careful to bring the listener along with me. So anyway, those were things. And then
listen, I want to tell you something. Like I've been to like so many different churches in my whole life, and I've listened to lots and lots of preachers. And Jim, you are like as good as 80% of the best Bible teachers I've ever listened to, as far as your speaking, your clarity, your voice, your content. I mean, you could easily, so I don't beat yourself up too much about your pace and so I mean, I think you're excellent.
Well, thanks, Greg. That's really encouraging. Great to hear you say that. Coming from you, I really appreciate that. But it's always good to kind of reflect and learn and try to improve and listen and
absolutely. I mean, I want to improve every time I speak. I want to do a better job.
That's right.
I want to do a better job. Was there anything content wise?
Well, this is kind of in between content and style and substance. So when I finished up, someone came up to me and said, wow, that was a bold move, not getting to Galatians until 40 minutes into it.
Somebody said that to you.
Yeah. And so, I don't know if they listen to the podcast, but if they are a listener of the podcast, then I think, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think they meant it to be like, just kind of a, teasing, maybe a half truth, but
right.
So I said this at the beginning, if you recall. I said, look, there's different ways to kind of set these things up. You could just say, look, let's just open the Bible and read Galatians 4. Now let's read Galatians 5. Now let's just plow through.
Right.
And we often do that in the study, and I've done that. And so, or you say, well, I got these, and you taught me this, I get this from you. Like, I got these three themes, and I'm just going to set up an order of importance. So number one is the most important. So if we don't get to two and three, it's okay, because we got to number one, and that was the real thing, right?
Yeah.
And if we never get to three, that's fine. And I said, this one is, oh, I said, there's a third one, which is like there's 7 points, and they all get to this climactic conclusion, number seven. And then I'm really stressed because if you got interruptions, you only get to six. And that was the Abraham talk was like that. I said, if I don't get to the climactic end where Abraham is going to sacrifice Isaac in the mountain, none of it makes any sense. There I go, clipping my sentences. None of it makes any sense, but it's not coherent if you don't get to point number seven in that kind of talk.
Right.
But this one was problem solution. So I spent like this setup talking about this problem of the Judaizers, but mostly of this whole rewards theology, which I think is a problem we've talked about in the podcast and before. And I think that's kind of a problem. I was trying to make the point that these are modern day Judaizers. And so Galatians is a solution for that. So therefore, I didn't get to Galatians until, and that was actually 36 minutes into the talk. So I went back and looked at their recording. But it's the first half hour, not getting to the text. And I think some people, they say, we're here for a Bible study. When are you going to get to Galatians? It's been 25 minutes and you haven't mentioned Galatians yet. I could hear that. So, but this is problem solution. So I was doing that for a reason.
Well, yeah, and you had a legit reason for the way you taught it that way, and I thought you communicated that well. By the way, one of the things I love about our Bible study is we have like 7 or 8 different teachers. Every single one of us has a unique style.
Yeah.
And I don't want, I don't have the feeling that I want all the other teachers to teach the same way I teach.
Right.
I really like the diversity. Like, I like that your style is different than my style. And so I'm not, I wouldn't want everybody to teach the exact same way. So it's kind of cool. I think that's one of the beautiful things about what we do is as we walk through the Bible and then we keep going through the Bible year after year, is different people teach the same passages, but they see it from a different angle and their teaching style is different. And I just think it's so cool. I just love that. And some people are like super, super practical. Some are more theological. Some are more, so we all have our different styles, but that's interesting. Now, were you aware, like, before that guy made that comment to you, like in your preparation, did you think, like, were you aware that you weren't going to get to Galatians? Like, you weren't?
I definitely was aware that I was going to go that I was going to set up the problem. And it wasn't like I was just talking about rambling about, my opinions. I was looking at scriptures, right? On the rewards theology and all the rest. So, so there was a reason for setting it up that way and drawing the parallel to the Judaizers. But no, I did. And then you recall at one point, one person said, I just have to say something, made a comment. And I said, maybe it's a good time for some more comments. I absolutely shouldn't have done that. Having tried to keep the conversation
there.
Yeah, and because then I looked down and said, "Oh shoot!"
3 hands went up
right away. And if you ask, and people want to talk, and that's why it's a Bible study. If we do that, but it's basically what happened. Then as I looked down at my watch, I'm like, it's 45 minutes in. I'm at the 30-minute point, 45 minutes in. And then you say, "Oh shoot!" I've got to kind of condense a little bit the things I was going to say. So, for example, there's a big story you and I talked about in the prep podcast about, if you really believe in rewards theology and, the question is just how well do you think you're going to do under this system? You think you're going to go to Jesus with confidence? And remember I said the example of like, well, let's say we're all in the waiting room and an angel bursts in and an angel says, all right, everybody listen up, line up in order of righteousness. I want the 10s in front because judging you is fast and easy. And the ones go to the back. And then I made the point, like you would see the apostle Paul running to the back of the line because he called himself the chief of sinners. I was all set to do that. But of course, that's a little story that goes on for, a minute or two. Like I just cut that out, go on to the next thing. And I like it. I think it really adds to the whole understanding
I
of
wish
the
you would
rewards
have.
theology.
Yeah, I wish you would have shared that.
Yeah, because even the line of, well, if you really do believe in this rewards theology, just how well do you think you're going to do? Because then you're taking a little pride in your spiritual accomplishments. Like, we don't, for our listeners tonight, we don't have to belabor. We talked about that in some detail in the prequel,
Right.
and it is additive, but it just shows you as you're going through, if you're like, oh, I'm behind on my marks at the 30-minute point, I should be here, the 45-minute point, I'll be here. Something's got to give. Like, and I got to the Galatians 5, the fruit of the spirit, and just covered it in 90 seconds. And
Right.
you could
You could have
talk
done
for
the whole thing on
the
that.
whole thing. In fact, in 2 years from now, if I do it again by luck of the draw, I'll probably just do the fruit of the spirit. We'll just do Galatians 5, and that's it. It's so rich. Obviously, it's one of the richer passages in the New Testament. The love, joy, peace. I mean, there's so much there.
Right.
And I kind of made one quick point on it, but it was just an example of like the pace, and got to cut out some material. And then, we all think I don't know, I think my material is all really, really important. And, studies show, I remember looking at studies years ago, Greg, that people say, if you and I have a great conversation, which is kind of why we started doing these podcasts. And then tomorrow I say, wow, we talk for an hour. What do we talk about? The most you're able to really summarize is 5%. And you
Yeah.
think about it, you
That's
say,
so
oh yeah, I said we already
discouraging.
talked for hours. Oh yeah, what'd you talk about? Oh, you just you
That's
can't
got to be
remember.
so discouraging to really to speakers, you know.
Yeah, I think my wife just heard about it. She was listening to something that said that reminded me of that little 5% stat.
I mean,
Because
today the sermon at church was fantastic,
it's fantastic. How much could you
but
remember? If we both tried to
I
summarize it now,
probably could only remember about 5 minutes of it.
5%. Unless you're taking careful notes, going through and review the notes like a student for a test. But they'd be like, that's why the faith comes through hearing. You just got to hear it again and again and again and again and again. So anyway, I did, on a real positive note, I did have a couple of people come up to me afterwards that morning and really, really positive feedback. And not just the feedback like, Jim, you did a good job. That's always nice.
Right.
But guys, a couple guys just come and talk about, excited about Jesus and excited about the gospel. And that's what I love.
That's
That
what
feeling
you
of like,
want.
oh my gosh, yeah, it's not,
Yeah, you don't need
Jim,
the
you
you don't
spoke
need the
well, but
attaboys.
no,
Attaboy.
no, right, I don't care. No, absolutely not. Or someone saying you spoke well, but you didn't get to Galatians until 40 minutes in, or but like someone saying, when it just resonating with the love of Christ and being saved by the grace and by the blood and the gospel. And like, there were a couple guys that came up, like 3 or 4, and like, you could tell they're just touching like this, this whole notion of that Jesus sanctifies me, that like, that it's not based on my performance. And they were in touch with the content of what you and I get excited. The reason why we're gospel addicts, right?
Yeah.
That Jesus is the one by faith. He's sanctifying me, not my hard work and effort. And and then yesterday, because it's
That
been a
makes
week.
it all worthwhile.
Oh
That
my
makes it
gosh.
all
Yes.
worthwhile.
So I had 2 guys come to me yesterday too to say that, boy, I was really thinking about what you said last week. And then one guy in particular yesterday morning, he said, I think the one thing you said that's sticking with me. I'm thinking like that change is not like the direct, he didn't say these words. I kind of rephrased it back. So what you're saying is this, because this is what I was trying to get. And he said, yeah, that's it. That's it. It's the idea that you don't change your life through direct application against your flesh. You change your life changes because your direct application is focusing on Jesus all the time. And then indirectly your life changes. That's the dotted line moving.
Yes.
And he was getting that. He's like, that's kind of like, really life changing,
See, the problem is we focus on ourself, and we focus like so much
right.
of even in the secular world is self-improvement.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
It's how can I change myself?
That's right.
So we just take that right into our Christian faith.
So it makes my faith
But it's really a byproduct, like really
yep.
True transformation is a byproduct of
A changed heart.
a changed heart, which
yeah.
is based on your gratitude and realization of what Jesus has done for you.
Amen. That's it exactly. And that's it exactly. Well, that's why I kind of felt bad. Like the worst moment for me, talking about cringe moments, was the question that I think I kind of flubbed. And then listening to again, I kind of recovered a little bit, but I didn't have the right thing to say right away. Was when someone says, "Don't works make you Christ-like?" Or do he said, "Do works make you more Christ-like?" And I just talked about this with the lines. I should have said the whole idea that works make you more Christ-like is like looking at little arrows pointed to your single line, notches on your belt. I did this work,
Right.
and it makes me a better righteous. It sanctifies me. It climbs me up the single line a little higher. Um, so I helped a little lady across the street. That's a good work, and now I'm a little more righteous, a little more Christ-like. Um, and that is, I had just talked about that. That's the complete single line model. That's the whole way of thinking of like, I am going to, through my works, make myself more Christ-like, and it's making your whole Christian faith about you. And thankfully, one of the people in the audience spoke up and said, "No, that's the dotted line." And exactly, that's what I just talked about. The dotted line is in reaction. My work is to focus on Jesus, and that's what that I wish I had this at the tip of my tongue, Greg. That verse that says, "What is the work?" Jesus' words. The work of what is the work that you need to do? The work of a
To
believer is to
believe in him
believe.
who's, yeah, to believe.
That the work is to believe, and then God is changing your life, and that actually is the fruit of the Spirit. That's Galatians 5, right? So I could have gone right to Galatians 5, saying, "No, your life is going to change." I draw it on my little chart on a dotted line, but the fruit of the Spirit is going to come through as a result of your Christian life, but it's not the point of your Christian life. So it's one of those things where I thought, I had the right words to say 30 minutes later, like I always do. But at the time, I just kind of fumbled it a little bit. So that's the worst moment I think that I would relive if I could do it again.
Huh. If we were interviewing, let's say the Apostle Paul and Peter were on this podcast, and we were to
Yeah.
ask them, we just asked both of them, as you grow as a Christian, do you find that you repent less and less?
No, they would,
And do you become a better and better person?
right.
What would they
They,
say? What would they
they,
say, Jim?
I'm repenting way more than I ever was before. I am,
Ex-
yes.
exactly.
Yeah, way, yes. Yeah. And that's a truth I think you've come to as well in your Christian life, right? Like it's,
Yeah. I mean, growing when you true spiritual growth is not, yeah, I mean, as a young believer and a young follower of Christ, I thought, okay, I'm going to sin less and less.
right.
But no, the opposite happens. Because your awareness of your sin, as you walk closer to God, the light gets brighter and you become more aware of the depth of your own
Yeah.
sinfulness. And so you need to repent more and more, not less and less.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
As
So,
Christ, and that's why the Apostle Paul would say, you know, on the one hand, we would say Peter and Paul are like two of the the greatest Christians who've ever lived. But if we were interviewing them, they would say, no, we're the greatest sinners that have
well,
ever lived.
because what makes them great is their lines were a billion miles apart. They were so far out on that scale. They had a proper sense of scale, right? Their awareness of God's holiness was massive, and their awareness of their own sin was equally massive in the opposite direction. And they saw that's why that verse said you point out that I did add in Galatians 6:14. May I never boast. Again, see, it's not my performance. I'm not thinking about me at all. May I never boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's the growing cross, right? So anyway,
Yeah.
so
Was there anything else that you took note of?
well, yeah, let me see here.
By the way, I found that verse that you were trying to mention is John 6:29, where Jesus says, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent."
John 6:29.
6:29.
Yeah, yeah, that's what you need to do. Um, and it's not
And
passive. I mean,
John,
there's something to do, but you got to completely stop trusting in your own life and your own works, and you got to. That's by the way, it's one of the points I was trying to make about how this rewards thing is so counterproductive. Because if you think you're going to do really well on the reward scale, you're putting more trust in your own efforts and your works and things your spiritual accomplishments that you can be proud of when you stand before the bema seat of Christ, as opposed to saying, you know what my work is? All my trust is transferred from my own performance to you, 100%.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I
Yeah. Um,
let's move forward.
yeah. So there were a couple things like that, just theologically, I thought that I could have gone to more. Again, people don't remember 5% anyway. Sorry. So there's like you could cram more stuff in, but it's enough. That's why an hour.
Like what?
Well, just the things I learned doing the getting ready for it. Like, I think you and I talked about it on the prep podcast, the prequel, about how John and Charles Wesley were transformed when they read that
The
Luther's
intro to
commentary.
Galatians from Martin Luther.
Yeah. And I think the story I was telling was how they had been missionaries. They were climbing this thing a line, basically. They were missionaries,
Yeah.
and then they were at a Bible study where the intro, I mean, Luther's commentary on Galatians was being read out loud, and they got to that verse, that portion where Luther says, "So then, have we nothing to do? No, nothing. It's all Jesus." And then they kind of like one of them. It wasn't actually the one of the Wesleys; it was another one of the companions. Was like started weeping and shaking, and everyone just started praying for him. And then later Wesley looked back and said, "I felt my heart strangely warmed," and like that was transformational, where they realized it's all by grace. So we talked about that a little bit, that story in the prequel. I didn't have to bring it up this time. I kind of knew I would not have time to bring that up. But what I found interesting theologically is that in getting ready for this talk, I always thought that was like a great testimony of how the Wesleys were, really bought into, they understood like sanctification is by grace, not just salvation by grace, but sanctification by grace too. And gospel driven sanctification that you and I was talking about. But I think I get them confused, Greg. I think Charles was the theologian, John was the hymn writer. Well, I think they both wrote some hymns. So the Wesleyans who listening to the podcast can write in and correct me on this. But I think actually later, Charles Wesley disagreed with Luther and became much more a feeling of like personal holiness is achievable in this lifetime. And it's kind of like people call like the holiness movement. That he felt like you could get to a point, Jesus starts you off, but you could get to the point where you're living a sinless life. And kind of the opposite of what you and I were talking about, kind of the opposite of Luther's view, by the way, and the opposite of the whole idea of the double lines, the whole idea of like, he basically, it almost maybe like, remember at one point I said, you can look at the double lines through a single line paradigm. You could say those lines are helpful as long as they help you become a more holy person. And maybe that's what he was doing. I don't know, but I thought when I was studying for it, that was really quite the distinction. I always thought, that, and I remember hearing hearing that much early on in my Christian life from someone who was a Methodist pastor. So he was a follower of Wesley, and he talked about the holiness movement, how important that was. And I didn't understand it at the time. But I thought, wow, so that's what he was talking about. It's almost like Pelagianism. We talked about that in a podcast once too, but this notion that, again, through your hard work and effort, you can move from being a lowly 2 to a 5 to a 7 to a 9.9, maybe even a 10. And actually, he would say a 10. You could be a 10.
Yeah. How is that? How does that not equate spiritual pride? I just don't, I don't get it. Like,
No.
I mean, there used to be these guys, I mean, and there still is, there used to be this guy who would come to the college campus, Brother Jed.
Yeah.
And he would preach, he would, just point at people and tell them they're all going to hell.
Yeah.
And then if you pulled him aside, he would say he was, he hadn't sinned in years or something like that. He was living a sinless life. I'm like, I think you just sinned by saying that. I mean,
well, look at Paul. I mean, like you just mentioned Peter and Paul if they were on the podcast, but like Paul says, I'm the chief of sinners. I am the chief of sinners. And
Romans 7.
Romans 7, I sinning constantly. Absolutely, Romans 7. Philippians 3 says, I put no confidence in the flesh, even though my record of righteous achievement is better than any of you. And I put no confidence in the flesh. And I consider all those righteous achievements filthy rags. Right?
Yeah. Peter, right after he made the great declaration that Christ is the Messiah, stuck his foot in his mouth and said that he wasn't going to let Jesus go to the cross. And Jesus turns around and says, "Get behind me, Satan."
Right. Jesus. Jesus calling
So
Peter Satan, right?
he just made like the biggest declaration, that he was, you know, that Jesus alone had the words of eternal life. He's the Messiah.
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
Peter denied Christ, and I think that people say that
two
so there's
minutes
no one.
later, 2 minutes later, yeah, then
Yeah,
he, yeah, I mean, those guys, um,
but Peter's
yeah,
denial. I think there was no one else present. So someone else pointed this out. I think this is. I don't know if this is universally agreed upon, but there's no one else there in the story but Peter. And so, how does anyone know about that story? He told someone, says, write this down, record this. I denied Christ 3 times. Peter, the
uh,
rock on which a church is built, is the one who said, this is an important part of the story. You got to get this right. I denied him. And for uh, Peter, Keller has a great sermon on this. He's got a great sermon on everything, but Peter had to rebuild his entire identity off of performance and onto trusting in Jesus for his righteousness. He had to make the shift to the double lines, basically.
right,
So,
right.
um, anyway, so that was the theological thing. There's one more theological thing, but it was way too deep to get into, and that is about. But actually, yesterday's study, it came up a little bit because we started talking about James and this notion that we distinguish between justification and sanctification, but not everybody in Christianity does. And I don't think the Judaizers distinguish that. In other words, they just talked about being justified. They didn't talk about justification and sanctification as two separate things. We say that because we say you're justified the minute you believe. The moment you transfer your trust from your own self to Jesus, you believe, and at that moment you're declared righteous. And then everything after that is the process of sanctification, how you grow in Christ. But justification just took place at that moment. Whereas a lot of other Christians, in the whole body of 2 billion Christians around the world, would say justification takes place at the end of your life. If you working with God together, you see, depending on how you lived, then you'll be just, you maybe. See, we say, I'm just, when I accept Christ, God declares me righteous.
Yeah,
And they would say, you might get declared righteous if you and God work together hard enough at the end of your life. That's when you'll be justified. And that's a big theological distinction. And I just didn't want to get into it, to be honest. I just kind of just talked about it in the way we've been talking about it, like as justification, sanctification, and kind of moved on.
yeah. Well, I think that was a wise move. Um, because we don't have to yeah, I mean I think that was a smart thing to do, to not get um distracted with a bigger theological
Yeah.
argument.
And
um
I'm an amateur anyway, right? So the part about, and sometimes we talk about this, like, there's lots of little theological avenues with every passage we read. You could go down lots of wormholes. Is that really worth doing with our time?
right,
Um,
yeah, that's why I thought the way you handled your time was fantastic, and I thought the talk itself was great. And I think the guys seem real. I pay attention to, they were really uh, listening to you and
really?
connecting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, um, yeah, I think
Oh,
it.
great.
Well, I mean, just the fact you had like four men, come up to you and share that. Those are the ones who came up to you, you know. And then you've had other people that said you really got me to think.
Yeah,
Um, the challenge for us in that group is we do have people from like 10 different churches.
that's right.
So every church kind of has a different theological bent. And
Yeah,
so you're almost always going to step on somebody's theological toes or doctrinal toes.
that's right.
So it's I think you and I are, every time we prepare, we're aware of that. And it's I think the smart thing to do is um to not get sidetracked,
Yeah,
to present your views as best as you can, and then and not get sidetracked into theological discussions over doctrines that it's okay if we disagree.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. I think that's right. And look, by and large, we as a group agree on the essentials, right? The Bible is God's revealed word.
The main things are the plain things.
The main things are the plain things. It's a good way to put it.
So those are the salvation.
That's right.
Um,
Through faith in Jesus, right? So,
yeah. Was there anything else, Jim? Was there anything else that did you make any
oh,
other notes of changes that you would make?
no, I think that's it. There's some
Do you wish you
uh
had a handout?
no, I don't know if handouts can be good or bad, you know. So
The handout would be nice for your two-line
actually
illustration.
that might be good. That might be good. Oh, yeah, actually, one thing I probably should start. So so for the two-line illustration, if anyone listened to it, I try to do an audio description of that anyone listening to this podcast could listen to. I have applied for a copyright for the whole illustration together.
Cool.
But probably, yeah. So we'll see how that goes. But you and I talked about it. I got the two lines from you like in 2006, 2007. So it was already circulating in Christian circles. You got it from someone else, but
I
not
assume so.
shared.
I don't think I'm smart enough to just like invent that on my own. I mean, sometimes I'm inspired. Like I do feel like some of the illustrations that I've shared with the guys have been inspired
Right.
by like the two thieves,
Right.
the three ways to live, I call it the three ways
Yeah.
to
That's really good. And your
yeah.
iceberg illustration, that's good too.
Yeah. The iceberg, I've seen that in different a lot of those are either adapted from somebody else's illustration or I always try to improve it. In fact, my
Yeah.
three ways to live, I'm thinking about changing it from the three ways are follow the rules,
Yeah.
follow the flesh,
Follow the
or
I
follow Jesus.
I like when you say follow your heart.
I say follow, yeah, I've been saying follow your heart, but I'm tempted to say follow your flesh because
Uh
the problem with saying follow your heart is people say, well, if you're a Christian, then God gives you a new heart. And then, there's the verses, delight yourself in the Lord. He will give you the desires of your heart.
yeah, right.
There's so much about
God is
like,
changing my desire, right? So right. And it should
so
be changing.
really the person on that side, they're, yeah, I don't know,
I don't
but
know. But the problem is like if they say follow the rules, I don't like someone says, well, I'm not a rule follower. I don't like that. I'd make follow the flesh. Well, I don't follow the flesh, I but if you say follow your rules versus follow your heart, I think the distinction for me that I love that
that's,
because
you feel like that's better, more clear.
yeah, and I always tell my kids like if we were growing up, every little kids movie they watch, the moral of the story is follow your heart, kids. Always, and we'd debrief, talk about the movies,
Right.
say, is that right? What if my heart says do this awful thing? What if my heart says I want to steal all your money?
Yeah.
Follow my heart. Is that right? The kids, well, no, but all the movies, all the kids movies, what's the most important thing is follow your heart. And so I
Right.
think that I love it when you say that because or you should just follow the rule. Anyway, I love it when you do that. I wouldn't
Okay.
change it.
Okay. Well, no, that's why we have these conversations because I want to get feedback. And I was just tempted this last time that I spoke on it because somebody did ask a question and they kind of got confused in that whole
Yeah.
idea of like, well, wait a minute, following your heart's not always bad because
After you're Christian.
God gives you a new heart. But I
Right.
think even after you're a Christian, you can go back to your flesh
You're right.
and
Yep.
you're
Like
kind of like following your sinful heart.
that's right. Like the guy who was a Christian and I this is told to me. I wasn't there, but he was in a Bible study. He was having an affair on his wife, and the guys were trying to say convict him of his sin and talk to him about it. And he said, "Hey," he held to the Bible and said, "This whole book says God wants me to be happy, and this makes me happy." Okay, he's following his heart. He's a Christian. He's
Yeah.
following his heart, and the guys around him are trying to say, "Dude, that's not what the Bible means. That's not what it says at all."
Right.
But he was following his heart. And anyway,
Man.
so
Yeah. Well,
hey,
he's
but the one thing
clear.
I want to, I'm sorry, what?
Oh, go ahead.
Well, we've been talking about this illustration for so long, and then I'm talking about the history of how I got it from you and how it was circulating. But it was part of it was published in 2009, and so as I'm writing this book, I keep talking about. I'm trying to make sure I do the acknowledgement and even in the copyright application to the acknowledgement. I think the authors were Thune and Walker. I don't even know if they're around anymore, or but it was published in 2000, and they didn't copyright the illustration. They copyrighted this Bible study booklet that had just the two lines and the cross between them. So that part, but
Yeah.
none of the other, not the single line, not the to compare it to, not the dotted line, not all the other parts. We've kind of, you know, built on that over time. So,
That was in 2009, but you heard it from me from 2006.
and I actually have notes. We were speaking on it in your college ministry in 2007.
Right.
So in 2008, I had like PowerPoints using it. So we were already using it before then. Now, so anyway, I try to be careful. I always would credit
See,
where credit is due.
I would, I have a, I feel like I was personal friends with Jerry Bridges.
Yeah,
He is really big on gospel driven sanctification.
yeah.
And I don't know that he ever like drew that diagram. I mean, I don't think it's in his books. But I wonder if he's part of the source of where I got it from.
He might
Uh,
have been. He might be the source where others got it from, and then someone in 2009 put it in their book and published. Right.
yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Anyway, that's really cool. I
Yeah.
mean, that's cool that you're copywriting it. And yeah, any other final thoughts, Jim? I think this has been a good debrief. Anything,
Yep.
any
No,
last words?
no, look, I'm just really glad you and I got to do kind of a 1-2 punch on Galatians.
It was awesome. It was fun.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
It was
such a
fun to
critical
do that.
book, and it's so great to just talk about the gospel, and Galatians is so perfect for that. So it was just a joy kind of doing it together.
It was. And we're moving into like Mark chapters 9 through 12, and then you're going to be teaching on First Corinthians.
13, love.
Is it?
That's the love chapter, right? I think. Yep.
Yeah, 13 to 16.
Yep. That'll be fun.
That's awesome. Is that also go into like the resurrected body?
Oh,
First
yeah, it
Corinthians
might.
15?
It might, right. Yeah, that'll be interesting. That'll be really interesting.
That goes into like heaven and stuff like that. Like
Yeah.
what are our well for First Corinthians 15 is about the resurrection of Christ, but then there's the resurrection of the dead and the resurrection body.
Well, let's leave it there. That's a nice enough teaser for our audience to tune back in.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're coming into some good stuff. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict podcast. Stay tuned for future episodes.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.